My name's Joe Hepburn and I'm the Data Management Practice Lead here at Bytes Software. Today I'm joined by Matt.
Yep, my name's Matt Locke. I'm the Technical Director for an organisation called Varonis in the UK.
And today we're going to be talking about DSPM. So Matt, what does DSPM mean to you?
So Data Security Posture Management. It is a concept that every organisation is now realising they have to tackle. It means that they have to understand the risks associated with all their data, regardless of where it sits. And as we live in a world of cloud and SaaS and all different repositories, data's in lots and lots of places, so it's a big challenge.
Yeah. We've seen DSPM become more relevant for customers. Customers are starting to ask us about it, but it's a relatively new topic. Have you noticed that customer projects and budgets being aligned to DSPM as a project for next year?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely. It's something that's been thrust into the limelight recently. Gartner coined it, 18 months, 2 years ago now. It's something that's always been there. Most organisations realise that they hold a lot of important, sensitive information, and they have taken, some steps to make sure that it's looked after. But I think having the concept of data security posture management means that it's an easier conversation internally. It's easier to identify that projects and budget need to be assigned to this. And it's just a great way of being able to quantify risk to demonstrate that, as a security outfit inside any company, they've got a good grip on all the data that they have. So yeah, lots of budgets suddenly appearing, projects appearing, it's a challenge that we've been tackling for about 20 years. So it's a joy to see it thrust into the limelight now.
One thing that we always talk about as an organisation, security is paramount for every company.
Yeah.
I think budget has been aligned to a lot of different security technologies. A lot of that's around infrastructure and network and all of that stuff.
Yeah.
Data has become paramount, and the reason for a network and the reason for infrastructure is essentially to house the crown jewels, your data. So the fact that companies are shifting towards that data security posture management and aligning budget and aligning projects and taking it more seriously, as you say, is a really interesting thing. Is there any particular topics that are driving those DSPM projects? Is there any particular challenges that customers are facing outside of the need to protect that data?
Well, lots. So I think it's over 50% of every breach that happened globally last year was on an identity. So we talk about historically what is the perimeter, and we used to be able to define the perimeter. The perimeter now are your credentials. It's your ability to authenticate and log on to an application, a SaaS app, a cloud repository, whatever it may be. And so if you think about your identity and how valuable that is, if that is compromised in any way, all of these historical things that we've spent money on, like firewalls and IPS and all these identity systems, tend to sort of fall to the side because I have an account that can bypass and authenticate and get access to all of these things. Yeah. So we hear a lot about things like identity threat detection now. A lot of companies trying to think about how can we protect the identity. But in terms of drivers for data security projects, it's because it's a very complex world we live in. We talk about this move to the cloud. I think most organizations have got an end goal to move to the cloud. We still have a lot of self-hosted on-premise file servers and databases. But of course, we're adopting things like IaaS, like S3 and Blob in Azure, and databases and infrastructure like Snowflake, and then we think about the SaaS apps like Salesforce and Box and Zoom and Slack, and all of these repositories inevitably hold sensitive information. And
it creates data silos as well.
It really does. And they all have their own way of implementing some level of control.
Yeah.
We're all very familiar with things like Active Directory, and now we have Entra for 365. But then if you think about putting information in Amazon, they're going to be using IAM. And Snowflake have their own way of doing it. And you end up with a lot of complexity of being able to ensure that your identity is protected. And so it really is a huge challenge for a lot of companies because they need to have a lot of experts internally. They need to rely on a lot of, maybe outsourcers, making sure that these things are configured properly. When you talk about DSPM, the P's the important bit. It's all important, of course, but P's about posture. And posture is about ensuring that the actual configuration of your platform is actually where it needs to be. Do you have MFA turned on? Do you have encryption turned on? Do you have all of these different parameters that these providers give you, but not necessarily enforce? So DSPM is about understanding what data is important to you as a business, the overall effective exposure, so understanding the effective access and how people can get access to this information, but also the posture. We hear about things like leaky S3 buckets and all of these things suddenly becoming exposed. It may be negligent. Quite often it's through just, people just, making mistakes. But there are lots of drivers now. There's the whole landscape, and we could talk about AI, and I'm sure we'll come on to it as well, because that's another huge driver for suddenly companies realizing that AI is actually data, and so therefore we need to address, like you say, the crown jewels.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's looked after.
I think AI, we've certainly seen as an organisation when we talk to companies about AI, you obviously start that journey at the end. What's the outcome you're trying to derive from AI? What people don't necessarily look at all the time is actually what do we work back in terms of a strategy? How do we make sure that the data going into that AI model is good, clean, secure data, and we don't have any vulnerabilities around? For all the will in the world, AI is a great thing. But there's questions that we can ask AI and co-pilots and large language models. And people maliciously or accidentally sometimes ask the wrong questions into an AI tool set.
Yeah.
So making sure that the permissions align to your data.
Absolutely integral.
AI does what it's meant to do. It goes and finds those answers.
Yeah.
But sometimes those answers are not things that everyone wants to see and share and have visible across an organisation. So
I think a lot of companies are realising that if you think about what is AI, AI has become one of these buzzwords. But if you break it down, what is AI? AI is a computer's interpretation of data. It requires a language model to be able to process the information. You ask it a question, interrogates data, and it gives you an answer that should correspond. So I think a lot of companies are realizing now that if we want to onboard things like AI initiatives, we've got to turn on AI security. AI security is data security, because it's about ensuring, like you say, that it gives the right responses, that it's not learning from information that it shouldn't, it's not poisoning the actual language model. AI is another driver, and there are the co-pilots. We've seen it a few times where people can surface information that they shouldn't. GPT's the same, Gemini's the same, Cloud's the same. But a lot of companies now are starting to build their own AI models because there are huge gains to be had from it. But again, we've got to address the underlying data that is growing exponentially and will continue to grow, to continue to get more complex.
And AI would generate data as well, not only the data that it's drawing from, AI itself will generate.
It's a perfect storm, Joe. It really is a perfect storm. We've got a lot of data that we can use and train our AI, and then AI is going to generate more data, and then where's that going to sit? We've got to make sure that it's secure and it's looked after. I had an interesting conversation recently with a company that, like every other company in the world, have been thinking about implementing retention policies but never really got round to them because of the complexity. And now they're suddenly realizing everything forever. And now they're suddenly realizing actually all this data that we've been hanging on to, we could use that to train our AI models. So an interesting concept. But nonetheless, it's a very challenging landscape. If you think about organizations that take on new applications that are going to make them more productive. Salesforce is a prime example. Huge amounts of data stored in Salesforce repositories. It's an integral part of most companies. But I don't think people quite realize just how much value is in that repository. And so what happens is when a company decides to maybe invest in an application like Salesforce, it's very common that they will invest in individuals to productionize it, to make it operational. And so you end up with teams of individuals who've got huge amounts of experience about tailoring and making sure that Salesforce is relevant to you as a business, and security is somewhat of an afterthought. It somewhat gets in the way.
I think there's an assumption sometimes that security is built into a lot of those SaaS-based platforms. And we know, working with lots of different clients, that's not the case. Shared responsibility models, all of those kind of areas of compliance.
And if you expect the CISOs and the security teams to understand the security of Salesforce and Slack and S3 and Blob and Snowflake and it goes on and on and on, it becomes very, very challenging. And then also, think about what DevOps do. DevOps is really suddenly have this ability to stand up things like managed and unmanaged databases in things like Amazon and Microsoft, which is amazing because they can test code and they can make sure that their work is how it should be. But we suddenly lose sight of what DevOps are doing, and we've seen it time and time again where a database will be stood up, they'll throw a load of data into it, run a few models to make sure that their code is working, and then forget about it and leave it. And suddenly you've got a very sensitive, exposed set of data sets. And again, you can't really expect security to be aware of it all the time. And so this is where DSPM and DSPM it's a platform. It's a platform that has to be able to interpret risks of all these different data sets. It needs to be proactive in mitigating and remediating the risks that it finds. There's no point having something else that tells you've got a lot of problems. When you live in this world of complexity, it has to be automated, and you have to think about, well, why are we actually going down the whole DSPM route? Is to protect our data. Most organizations have a limited number of individuals. We all know about resources are very, very difficult. And so we spend a lot of our time just demonstrating how we can automate, just a lot of it. We can just keep that low level of risk sustained without any human intervention. Automation used to be a bit of a scary word a few years ago. Everyone was a little bit worried about automation. We need change control, and we need to make sure it's monitored and we can roll back, and those are all very important initiatives. But I think it's really been embraced over the last 12 months or so. It really is how we're going to ensure that if somebody does make a mistake, if a bucket does become public, if somebody starts creating public links in Salesforce, and how can we make sure that we just mitigate it straight away? And that's where DSPM comes in. It needs to be driven by the outcomes that you're trying to achieve as a business, and it needs to automate as much as you possibly can, because otherwise you end up with lists and lists and lists of support tickets for support to get round and go and fix this, and we'll never get round to it. And painting the fourth bridge.
Visibility is one thing, I guess, as you say, and it's absolutely paramount in that world. But automated remediation and being able to do that at scale is a really key piece of the portfolio.
Absolutely.
I think ransomware is obviously something that keeps people awake at night. Getting an understanding of, unfortunately, the topic of conversation is when it happens and not if it happens to your organization.
Sure.
If you haven't had a ransomware attack, it's probably because you don't know that you've had a ransomware attack, as opposed to it not actually occurring. How does Varonis support that ransomware scenario, being able to remediate from a ransomware attack?
Well, it starts with visibility, and visibility about what's important. But there's so much information that organizations hold. We've got to make sure that we are focusing the efforts in the places that we need to focus. And so ransomware is, it's probably the noisiest insider threat that there is. It's probably the only insider threat that actually advertises that I'm inside and I'm doing damage. I think it's matured a lot over the years. If you get a ransomware note, it's pretty much job done. The data's gone. I think most organizations realize now that there are ways of circumventing. We can have backups. We can, maybe in a few weeks get us back to where we were. And so data is leaving your environment, leaving the network, leaving your cloud repository, leaving your managed, unmanaged infrastructure, and then they'll encrypt it. So again, visibility is really important. But it all comes down to ensuring that the right people have access to the right data. We talk about this concept of the blast radius, which I think is becoming one of these terms that's really growing with strength now. And it's a way of being able to quantify the impact of an account being compromised. We talk about identity. We talk about people aren't breaking in anymore. They're logging in. The organizations like Lapsus, a couple of years ago just showed how easy it was to just go and get hold of any credential and just authenticate and log in. And so what is the overall blast radius? What is the amount of information that account can get access to? And it's in a lot of scenarios eye-watering.
Yeah.
When we went into lockdown, when the pandemic kicked in, the number of organizations that told me that they accelerated their 2-year project to get to 365 in 2 weeks because of the necessity. And it genuinely got us through the pandemic, and it allowed us to be productive and continue working. But what it did at that point in time is we subconsciously made the decision to take away permissions management from IT and give it to the business. We can now share information with anybody who we want to share it with, maybe not externally, but certainly internally. And so every time you share information, you're making a change to the permission structure.
Yeah.
And, 3, 4, 5 years later, the amount of data that's accessible to everybody inside an organization is absolutely eye-watering. We're talking hundreds of thousands of collaboration links that are still active, that people can still utilize and get access to information. And, 80, 90% of them don't need to be there.
Yeah.
So again, think about...
That's a Microsoft statistic as well, isn't it?
Yeah,
absolutely.
I think
it's 90% of permissions.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I think that was 99, I think it got to at one point. But it's another one of those situations where the identity is key, and if we can stop the identity being compromised, amazing. But if it does get compromised in any way, there's only ever one question that people want to know the answer to, and what data was taken. So we need to be able to reduce this exposure, reduce this blast radius, and again, in things like collaboration platforms and complexities of Salesforce and S3, whether they're IAM structures, again, you need to have some platform that's assessing and looking at the risk and the exposure, taking into account the context of the actual data, and then making informed decisions to mitigate and remove that in near real time.
Yeah.
And then when you are in a position where you feel that you're comfortable to turn on things like AI and Copilot and GPT and Gemini and all of these things, then that you've got an environment that is accessible by the individuals that need to have access to it, which AI will use those credentials that you use.
Yeah. We've talked about it before in the fact that data security and people with knowledge around the data security market are at a premium, and so a lot of organisations don't have that resource in-house.
Yeah.
Is there anything Varonis that can do to help solve that challenge for an organisation?
Yeah, absolutely. So 20 years we've been doing this for. We've got pretty good at it now. I think, in the last couple of years, we've really adopted the approach that we don't want our customers to lift a finger. We want this to be a completely self-healing platform. You can define what's acceptable, but the platform is really designed now to automate as much as we can. So it's automating and removing and revoking access. We talked about that already. Think about the guest access where you allow third parties to come in. They may be stale. We don't need them all. Let's remove them. There are initiatives now around implementing data loss prevention, which is another one of these projects that's been kicking about for years and years and years. I think a lot of companies are now wanting to do this, and so labeling is a great way of being able to, particularly in the Microsoft world, being able to enforce policy. But again, it needs to be automated. You've got thousands and thousands and millions of data sets. They all need labeling. So again, that gets automated. Apply the right labels to the right sets of data. And then the other side of it, you have to ask yourself, well, why are we actually implementing a DSPM platform? It's to protect our data. Locking it down, making sure the permissions are right, making sure we know what information is important, making sure we're disposing information that we shouldn't have is all important work. But think about that account that's compromised. How do we then protect ourselves against an authorized account? Or maybe it is a sophisticated attack, or maybe it's an APT. So you need to think about, we need to be able to identify threats. And so we've been helping organizations with the whole threat piece for a long time now, understanding privilege, understanding behavior, roles, peer relationships. All of these are important ingredients. And so with all of that automation that we do, we now actually wrap a service around it. We call it MDDR, which is Managed Data Detection and Response. And so we are monitoring every single customer's environment, all of their tenants, all of their data, Everyone has an analyst. They're constantly looking at all the activity, any alerts. We're going in, we're investigating, we're closing them out. And we only ring the customer if we need to ring them.
Yeah.
And so we've been doing this now for probably about 18 months, nearly 2 years. And about 5 breaches a week we think we're stopping.
Yeah.
Because we're catching it at the identity. We're seeing those accounts being compromised, suddenly logging on from places that aren't normal, or maybe they're logging on at the same time from 2 different places, or suddenly an account is trying to look for information that typically is abnormal to what it does. So we are in a really, really good position now to be able to identify a compromised account. We don't need you to do anything. You don't need an army of people. We'll do it for you. And if whatever reason maybe that identity gets missed, it's typically an insider, somebody who's thinking, I didn't get that pay rise I was hoping for, or I'm going to go and work for company X because they're offering, but whatever reason it might be, that's really hard to spot. And so that comes down to behavior. But even then, if it is behavior that, again, is difficult to spot, it comes down to the data. So we're monitoring the data as well. So we automate as much as we can. And then when it comes to the threat piece, we're looking at everything. It's eyes on glass, 24/7, 365, and actually proactively stopping breaches from happening.
It's a true extension of an organisation's, IT team, effectively, and that's
Absolutely.
outsourced to a third party, as
Absolutely.
you say, that almost have that air gap, I guess, from a relationship and
Sure.
a malicious insider perspective. You have that kind of third party pair of eyes on that 24/7. So it's really powerful.
You do, but I think the thing, it's all about we start with the data, so we know what information is important, because we're collecting all of that information, we're constantly assessing it, constantly analysing it, constantly labelling it, all of those things that need to happen. So yes, it is third eye, another set of eyes looking at your environment, but it's all about the data.
And having those learnings, as you mentioned, Varonis have, and having that 20 years worth of experience, we've seen other providers in the market go out and acquire DSPM-based organisations, startups that get integrated into a larger security vendor, say. And I guess that's just testament to actually, that DSPM is going to be a big project and a big need for organisations next year. The experience that Varonis have over those 20 years just makes the platform that bit more robust and resilient and mature, I guess.
Absolutely, yeah, and the individuals, we've got people with years of tenure working for our organisation that have seen every project that you could possibly imagine, every type of initiative, whether it be a merger, an acquisition, or whatever it may be. So all of that knowledge is absolutely key. You talk about, data security people who are a premium. Yeah. We've got a lot of people who've been doing it for a long, long time. Yeah. So it's
at a premium.
At a premium, yeah, of course. But it's a market. It's an initiative. I urge every company to just think about what are you doing to ensure that your data is safe. Do you have eyes on everything that's important? Do you know where you're processing information? Do you have a good understanding of what the SaaS applications that you've invested in are doing, what they have access to? There's also other things that we need to take into account, things like third-party apps. Think about at any point in time, I'm sure we've all approved some application to get access to our mailbox and our calendar. There may be some great, but what actually does that application have access to? What does it do? So a lot of companies are suddenly realizing now that there's all these third-party apps that have access to this information. So I'm not trying to paint a picture of doom and gloom, but I'm trying to bring to the forefront
to be realistic.
That there's a lot of risk and a lot of exposure, and the more we take on, the more SaaS apps that we build into our environment, the more risk we're inheriting. Yeah. So it's important that every company understands where all the information they have is, where it's important, and they have some way of getting eyes on it, some way of protecting it, and mitigating and enforcing the posture that should be in place to ensure that it is protected.
Yeah. I guess shadow IT's been a problem for a long time, and
Yeah.
most organisations, they don't want to stop innovation, they don't want to stop agility and collaboration of their workforce by adopting some of these platforms. But it is an issue. So visibility of who's using what where
Sure.
is critical, as you say, because different attack vectors, open spaces,
Yep.
different third-party apps.
Yep.
That just increases potential for a cyber event.
It really
problems.
does, yeah. It's a challenge. I wouldn't want to be a CISO at the moment. So you need all the help you can get, and I think we feel we're in a very good place now. We've got a lot of customers. We protect a lot of data. We're stopping breaches every day of every week at the minute, but it's a challenge. I think one of the things that companies have realised is that trying to interpret different applications or different solutions that are out their own way of implementing security can get very difficult. I mean, Amazon will provide you with something like Macy to go and do discovery, and we know Microsoft have their Purview to go and do that, and Google have their own way, and just being able to get the same concise information from each of them becomes a real challenge. So again, this is where DSPM helps mitigate that, because it's a platform that can take feeds from any data sources and then normalize it and give you that effective view of what's important, effective view of access. We implement a very simple acronym called CRUDS to give you an understanding of access. And CRUD stands for Create, Read, Update, Delete, and Share. And if you look at maybe something like Amazon, maybe S3, you'll see that to get access to a data set can be via any number of ways. That there's roles, there's permissions, there's groups. Salesforce have their profiles and the permission sets, and there's all these different permissions that you get given as an account. But what is your effective? What do you actually have the ability to do, and on what? And I think simplifying it and taking all of those variables into account and giving you a nice simple way to say this account has the ability to read and delete and share information, and this is how it's been achieved, is really how organizations are then going to make sure they're enforcing that least privilege model, which they want to do now.
I think simplification is a really good point, and on the face of it, looking at this DSPM journey, it's quite probably an eye-watering prospect for a lot of organisations.
Sure.
From a Varonis point of view, how do we help to get customers on to that journey? What can they do as a starting point to kind of help them move into the DSPM world?
Understand your risk. Understand your risk. Every single organisation that has become a Varonis customer over the years that we've been doing this now began their journey by running what we call a data risk assessment. It's completely complimentary. We don't charge for it, of course, but we basically give organisations Varonis for a month, whatever period of time that they typically need it for. And it will act as a full-blown DSPM solution. It will analyse all the information that they deem to be important, and it may be regulatory information. That's obviously common across most companies, but think about that information that's really important to you as an organisation. We did an assessment for a book publisher recently. They need to know about ISBN numbers. We work with healthcare providers who need to know about specific account information. So think about what is really important to us, and then we will then find it. We'll then show you the risk, the exposure, and then we'll then show you how we can start to mitigate it as well. And actually, whilst all that's happening, we're monitoring it all. If we see any risks, any threats, any compromises, then we'll tell you, and then we can also mitigate it as well. But the most important thing is that if you run this assessment, at the end of it, you have something tangible. You have a report that then outlines the risks that you probably were aware that you have, but also a journey to fruition and a plan of how we're going to then tackle over the coming months to make sure that we can, start to mitigate and remove all of that excessive risk that shouldn't be there.
Yeah. So in order to uptake a data risk assessment, it's just a case of reaching out to your Bytes account manager or your Varonis rep.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. More than happy to help. It's very, very easy, lightweight to get up and running. Minimal infrastructure, if any, at times, and you get to see your data in a whole new light.
Yeah, I know we've certainly had some customers take the DRA,
Yeah.
and you don't know what you don't know. And in certain scenarios, there's been a live ransomware event occurring within an environment.
Or one that happened many years ago and
Yeah.
you weren't even aware that happened. Yeah.
It's a really powerful thing that we'd encourage all organisations to take.
Absolutely.
Thanks so much for the chat today, Matt. The one thing that I take away from the conversation is that data is absolutely paramount to every organisation. The value that we can add into customers is probably as a starting point, the data risk assessment, because that seems like a hugely powerful tool to give a customer a view as to what they don't know today, and it kickstarts their DSPM journey.
Absolutely. I mean, arguably data is the most important asset that every company owns. Without data, most companies are dead in the water. And I think the board are aware of this, and they want to know, is their data safe? So, I guess the takeaway from this conversation is it's your responsibility as a CISO, as a security team, to make sure that you understand the most important asset that you have as a business and the risks around it. So, do some discovery, identify where you're storing information, what applications you're using, and then get some eyes on it and make sure that it's been looked after.
Yeah. So to take advantage of a data risk assessment, people just need to reach out to their Bytes account manager or their aligned Varonis representative.
Sure.
And look to take up the opportunity to deploy the DRA.
Yeah, I mean, you can get hold of me. All my details are on LinkedIn, and obviously, however you want to get in touch. But yeah, either via yourselves or us, and we can get it in place.
Brilliant. Thank you.